All right. So, a bit to get through. Try to keep it as short as I can. This is some somewhat important stuff. Probably a good one to take some notes on. Hopefully, you're familiar with this stuff. It's been a long time since I was in high school, and the curriculum has changed so much. I don't know if this is something you guys are familiar with or not. Hopefully, you are. At the very least, hopefully, you've seen these things before. Best case scenario, this is a refresher. Worst case scenario, you've never seen these things in your life. This being a college class. College classes are less about teaching fundamentals and more teaching you like advanced techniques and teaching you like academic genres and stuff like that. So we won't be able to spend a lot of time on this, as this is something that's considered about as fundamental as it gets to um, analysis and just understanding what texts are. So if a lot of this is sort of new for you, highly recommend kind of going online, maybe watching some YouTube videos. I'm going to send a YouTube video on one element of this, but if you're not familiar with this stuff, you definitely ought to be. And unfortunately, we won't be able to spend a ton of time. And in fact, this is really the only time we'll spend on this. And after this, you'll kind of be expected to know it. But don't worry. I know this is all very vague so far, but don't worry. It's not difficult. You all are very intelligent, and I think we'll, even if it is somewhat new, you'll pick it up pretty quickly. So let's dive in. So let me share my screen. Actually, before I do that, I should share that I've published on our Blackboard earlier in the week. I don't know how many of you have seen it. I didn't do an announcement on it. The assignment sheet for the analysis paper. I've uploaded the assignment sheet and then a walkthrough of it. It's about a 40-minute video of me kind of going line by line on that assignment sheet and kind of walking everyone through how to read the assignment sheet. So be sure and watch that. Yeah, and so usually I don't do assignment sheets until much closer to the time of the assignment, but it made sense with this kind of being a more complex assignment, a lot of moving parts, a lot of things you're going to kind of be expected to do. It made sense to go ahead and show you that assignment sheet, walk you through it so that as we're going through the content of the analysis section, you kind of know what to be looking for, things like rhetorical appeals, things like exigence and stuff like that. So be sure and take a look at that. Yeah, so let's share my screen. All right, so what we're looking at is the rhetorical triangle. I want to teach you guys Aristotle's version of it. There's a lot of different versions of this for some reason, apparently. But this is kind of the classical version. And yeah, so the rhetorical triangle is a great visualization of what texts are, a way of breaking down texts in a way of showing what all identifiers go into making a text its unique self, while also giving us terms and things that really help us analyze elements of a text. The important thing to understand is that it is a triangle, right? What's profound about that? So a triangle is interconnected, right? All these points are connected with one another. That's the same as texts, right? So with a rhetorical triangle, at the top we have speaker. We're going to talk about the rhetorical appeals later, ethos, pathos, logos, but for now let's focus on speaker, audience, and message. There we go. So speaker, audience, message. So these are the primary elements of a paper that you are going to analyze in your rhetorical analysis essay. These are the main things I'm looking for you to identify and discuss. Who is the speaker? Who is the audience? And who is the message? But doing this by itself, just saying the audience of this commercial is people who like to kayak. I don't know, right? And they're selling kayaks. That's not enough, right? It's not enough to discuss the audience in a vacuum. In the same way, it's not enough to discuss the speaker in a vacuum or the message in a vacuum, right? Good analysis is able to discuss all these elements as deeply interconnected with one another. And that's what's so interesting about the rhetorical triangle, what makes it so effective as sort of a visual aid, is it shows this, that if you separate any of these things from the others, you're missing something important and your analysis will ultimately fail. In the same way that if you take one of these elements away from a text, it is no longer a text, right? Obviously, if you don't have a speaker, in our case, a writer, or more generally speaking, a rhetor. Rhetoric is the persuasive use of language. A rhetor is someone using rhetoric. So for us, it's a writer. In Aristotle's day, they were always speakers. They weren't really writing a lot of things down to be persuasive. They were usually speaking in the agora or like the public square or the forum. Um, Obviously, you don't have a writer or speaker, there's no text because no one's creating a text. Obviously, if there's no message, right? If there's no content to what they are saying, right? You can imagine a speaker, but they're speaking gibberish, right? Then you no longer have a text in the true sense. And then if it doesn't have an audience, right? And so the way I think about this is if I were to paint a painting and then put it in a closet and no one ever sees it. I saw it during the making, but then I just closeted it away. Is it still art? I don't think so, right? Art is art whenever it has an audience, when it's being viewed, when it's affecting people. That's how we define good art, right? Is when it's being put into some sort of public space, if it's the internet or a gallery or something, and then people are looking at it and then being like, oh, this is affecting me in some way. It's making me feel something, or it interests me, or I find it, fantastic and technically brilliant. So without an audience, if you were just to write an essay and then put it in your desk and no one ever saw it, it's not really a text anymore. And so, and when all these three things are brought together, then you have a text. And so in the same sense, your analysis has to account for that. Your analysis has to account for the speaker, the message, and the audience, identify them, but also show how they are interconnected to create a complex and unique text. Right. So let's kind of look at each of them individually. What you're going to be expected to do in your analysis. Again, I have that breakdown so you can kind of walk through exactly what those expectations are. But I'm looking for a discussion of each of these. I'm looking for them to at some point be identified, where you're overtly identifying the speaker of this text is this, and most primarily what they want, what that speaker is bringing to the text, right? Because speakers aren't passive. Writers aren't just passively writing without some sort of agenda, right? They want something. They're spending all this time and energy and effort composing a text. They're doing that for a reason. And it's your job as someone doing analysis to at least discuss that or point to what that reason might be. So here, the creator of this graphic says that the speaker is the creator of the message, positions her or himself as the one who has the knowledge, is fair in presentation. Okay, that's getting into the ethos. So not the most awesome of descriptions, but this is the best graphic I could find on Google. And so the speaker is bringing that sort of desire or agenda to the text. Message, so they say this is the actual message the speaker's giving, and then a bunch of rhetorical questions. Not a fan of their write-ups of this. Anyway, so the message is the thing actually being said, right? And it's difficult sometimes to disentangle the speaker from the message, right? And as a person doing analysis, you don't really have to totally disentangle them. And in fact, completely disentangling them, discussing them in a vacuum, kind of is missing the point of analysis. You're really wanting to disentangle them just enough that you can identify it and speak about it as its own thing, the message, but not so much so that you're ignoring kind of why the speaker has chosen this message, why they are presenting the message the way that they are presenting it. And so the message, ultimately, what you're really looking for in analysis is how is the message being presented? And really the message is where you're applying the rhetorical appeals. Are they using pathos and trying to affect the audience's emotion? Is the message logical? Are they building an overt logical argument saying this will happen, and if that happens, then this will happen, and if that happens, then this will happen, and that is good or that is bad? That kind of mechanical building is logos, logic. Or ethos? Are they spending a lot of time saying like, I'm the best, I know all the things, you should trust me, you should believe me because I'm an authority on this? Um, if so, they're building up their ethos, right? And it's usually a red flag if they're spending so much time having to justify their own ethos. Usually they're just bringing the ethos to the table, hopefully. And we'll talk about that in a moment. So yeah, what is the nature of the message? How is it being presented? And then you have audience. The audience, just like the speaker, they have their own, um, desires and agendas, things that they want from the world around them, things they want from the speaker. But audiences also have like preconceived notions about things. They have attitudes. They have a history, right? Obviously as individuals they have history, but when you think about, excuse me, public discourse. So hopefully that's a term that you've at least seen before. This idea of discourse. Discourse is a large ongoing conversation, right? So like Twitter is an incredible example of public discourse, right? When some new topic arises, a big one right now is AI art. Um, and all the people kind of throwing their hats in the ring and discussing AI art, being for it or against it, or saying, hey, this is really complicated, we need to keep an eye on it, right? And this, how the same topic is showing up, the idea of something being trending, that is discourse. If a topic is trending, that means there's a lot of discourse surrounding that topic. And audiences sometimes kind of have like groupthink, right? Where there's sort of a general consensus that we like this thing, we don't like this thing, we're worried about this thing, we're excited about this thing. And a really good writer or speaker is sensitive to that. They know what the audience is bringing to that topic, and they know, okay, I'm going to be affirming what the audience believes. And since what I'm saying is kind of naturally synchronizing with their attitudes, maybe I can push them a little bit, versus the audience is going to be very resistant to my position. And so I need to be really careful and not overextend my position because I know that they're going to try to poke holes in it. That was really creepy. That's my cat. Right. And so a good speaker is sensitive to that, understands what the audience is bringing, what their preconceived notions and worldviews are, and kind of how discourse is unfolding, what its kind of tenor is. Right. So those are the three main ones. You have your rhetor, a speaker or a writer. You have the message, which is like kind of the text or speech itself, and its kind of internal structure. And then the audience and what that audience is bringing and what they expect. Um, and then the most important part of all of this is this red circle, which is context. And we kind of already touched on it a little bit when we're talking about what the audience is bringing, those preconceived notions. Audience is really where you're going to see context the most at work, but context goes even further out than that. Context can be like historical context, right? So when we start talking about AI art, right? And then you bring in context of things like NFTs, or how like AI art is another digital trend like Bitcoin, which has recently collapsed, right? And so like being able to bring in an understanding of what has come before, in a historical sense, but also what's kind of going on around it immediately, right? So you might say like, how has the discourse shifted in the last few days before this text is published, right? Being able to bring that kind of context in is absolutely essential to good analysis, right? Because in the same way that your analysis ultimately fails if it's taking the speaker or the message of the audience and just discussing those things in a vacuum, in the same way, if you're just discussing the text in a vacuum, you're missing out on really important things. This text is alive in a sense. It fits into an environment in the same way that an animal fits into an environment, right? Texts are like animals in ecosystems. They are, in a sense, not to labor the metaphor too much, as my cat is about to knock something over. Some texts are like a predator, right? They're looking to destroy other arguments. Maybe other speakers have put out arguments, and then this text is meant to go out there and prey on other arguments. Others are just sort of there to be informative. And you think about like how grass in an ecosystem is like at the bottom of the food chain, and is what gives energy to that second layer, which gives energy to the next layer. And so people who are just going out there and giving information, they're not really making arguments necessarily. They're just like Wikipedia is a really great example of something like that. And so texts operate in this really alive way, and they fit into these ecosystems of discourse in really interesting ways. And it's kind of your job in the same way a biologist goes in. And when they're describing a species, they're not just describing its anatomy. They're not just saying, okay, here's the bone structure, we're done. They're saying, okay, what are its behaviors like? How does it fit into the food chain? How does it fit into the ecosystem? How does it fit into this context? And it's only when they've described the animal internally as well as how the animal fits into all of its externalities, then you've described the species. Sorry, I think I just hit my mic. Same way with the text, right? You're looking to paint that picture of what's going on internally with the text, as well as how that text fits into a larger external environment. And so you have to be able to consider this context. And so for your rhetorical analysis assignment, you're going to pick two texts to analyze. It's not going to be enough to just pick a text and analyze it. You're going to need to think about that topic. Having you guys spend all this extra time, considering a topic, is hopefully to allow you to determine that context, to kind of get a feel for this context surrounding the topic. You need to do this when you pick your texts. It's important to look into like, who is the writer? If you pick a web article, click on that writer. Usually at the bottom of the page, it'll show who the author is, especially if they're writing for like a web journal, if they're like a Kotaku writer or something like that. Hello, Kat. Look into their publication history. What types of things do they write about? Can you pick up any patterns where they're clearly pushing a certain kind of idea or a certain kind of product or a certain kind of, ideology or whatever? If so, discuss that. Discuss that when you're talking about the speaker. That is context. How can you bring what's going on outside of the text in and show how that context is framing the nature of this text? Because you can imagine one text. Today, if I wrote about AI art, it would be different than if I wrote about AI art 3 years ago, right? When that tech didn't really exist. Versus if I wrote about it 3 years from now, when who knows what's going to happen with it, right? And so the context deeply determines the text. Texts are fundamentally different depending on its what we call kairos. So kairos is Greek for timeliness, and a lot of people consider kairos to kind of be the fourth appeal other than ethos, pathos, and logos. It's timeliness. And the best example of kairos is joke telling. So if you think about like stand-up comedians, the best stand-up comedians are incredible with comedic timing. They can read an audience and they know when to give a little bit of a pause before a punchline versus when to go straight into the punchline. And any of you who are bad joke tellers like I am, you never really figure out that timing. Sometimes it's difficult to find that comedic timing where the joke is objectively funny. Anyone who's ever heard a funny joke, laughed, and then tried to retell it and butchered it, that's kairos, right? Right. So being able to consider something like that, the timeliness of the text and the way the time and the discourse and the context is influencing the speaker, or influencing the message, or influencing the audience in some way. Anytime you can bring that in, even if it's just a tiny little thing, that makes for great analysis. And that's the big thing I want to push with you guys is don't overthink your analysis. I'm of the philosophy, I don't think writing can really be taught. I think that so much of writing is instinctual, so much of writing is intuitive. And I'm going to teach you like tools and skills and stuff like that. But ultimately, to be a really good writer, you just kind of have to sharpen your intuition, sharpen that timing, sharpen your sense of what makes for a good idea, what makes for a good connection to make and stuff like that. And you just get better at it. If you're not great at it yet, you will be the more you do it, right? It's just like telling jokes. The more you do it, the better you get at the timing. That's true with every skill in the human universe, hard or soft, every skill you just get better at time, and writing is a skill. And so hopefully this course will just give you the space to kind of explore those skills and practice those things. Right. So, if you have any questions about the rhetorical triangle, please email me. If you want to Zoom about it, I'm happy to meet with you guys. This course is mostly self kind of guided. I would send out resources, but you guys are smart cookies, and the way this has all been explained to me is I just kind of put the resources out there, and you do with them as you will, and you complete the assignments. So, not my favorite way to deliver education, but it's more accessible for you guys, and allows you to kind of go at your own pace. So that's cool. But please do reach out. If this description, I know that kind of my style of lecture, kind of inflow isn't necessarily for everybody. There's a lot of really great resources out there on the rhetorical triangle and this analysis stuff. So again, the college level courses are more to test for more advanced skills, and not really so much on things like this that are considered more fundamental. And again, hopefully you've seen all this stuff, or hopefully it's just intuitive. All of these are things that you already have knowledge or skill with, and maybe this is just putting words to it, right? That you knew audience message and speaker make up text, but you've never seen like a graphic like this, and now hopefully things are sort of aligning for you. So right. So this is the rhetorical triangle. This is what texts are. So now I just want to spend a little bit of time, this is already running a little bit long, on ethos, pathos, and logos. So I do have a YouTube video I'm going to send out along with this one. There's going to be a breakdown, but just really quickly, pathos is the easiest one. So pathos is emotion. So anytime that a speaker or writer is writing in a way of trying to make an audience feel something, and it doesn't just have to be happiness or sadness. Excuse me. It can be a lot of things. It can be excitement, just drama, right? When something is being presented in a very dramatic way, that is pathos. I like to call it gravitas, like kind of presenting something with gravity, but it's very much pathos. Excitement, humor is a big one with pathos, especially in today's age. Humor is, we really like humor, especially like irony or sarcasm and stuff like that. That is pathos. So literally anything that isn't a logical statement, an argument making, or isn't about authority is pathos. Most things are pathos. Logos is just logic. And so the thing about logos isn't just good classical argumentation. So the way that arguments work, and we'll get into this when we do argument, is a series of premises followed by a conclusion. So an example of a classical syllogism, a classical argument, is something like Socrates was a man. All men are mortal, therefore. So those are two premises. Socrates was a man. One statement that can be true or false. Socrates, or all men are mortal, a statement that can be true or false. From that follows the conclusion, and the conclusion is Socrates was mortal, right? Because we get that from those two statements. If both of those two statements are true, then the conclusion must be true. There's no world that we can imagine in which Socrates is a man and all men are mortal, and Socrates is not mortal. This is classical logic. So that's a deductive argument. There's also inductive argumentation, something like the sun has risen every day for all of history. Therefore, the sun will rise tomorrow. So this is an inductive argument. This is how science works, right? They do experiments, they study things, and they say, okay, well, based on what we've seen, we can expect that the phenomenons we've measured will continue in the same way, right? We've measured atoms, they tend to do this, therefore they will continue to tend to do this. Those are like classical arguments. That's logos. Hopefully you've seen logical fallacies before. Things like slippery slope, ad hominem, things like that. Those are logos. In fact, logical fallacies are usually taught as like, oh, avoid logical fallacies. They're bad arguments, and they're flawed arguments. Therefore, they are like, don't use them. Um, I don't like teaching fallacies that way. Don't commit fallacies; they're bad, and remove your ethos and destroy your personal integrity, and just make for bad arguments. But there's little in the public sphere more effective than a fallacy that codes as logic. Fallacies are extremely dangerous when they're not caught. Things like slippery slope fallacies, where we say, if this small, seemingly inconsequential thing happens, then this moderate thing will happen. And directly after that, catastrophe, right? So we're saying from this tiny thing, from this tiny domino, we get the world ends, right? Where in reality, first off, the odds of that whole sequence coming to reality is slim to none. And then presenting it as though all of those events are deeply or extremely close to one another in causality, whereas in reality, there's like 1,000 steps in between. So it's this idea, if we take this one step, we slide down the slope. Um, Slippery slope fallacy is one of the most dangerous fallacies in the human world when it's not caught. And so when when a speaker or writer is using a fallacy effectively, that is logos. And hopefully we're calling them on it, and hopefully we're aware of that, like, oh, this person is using fallacious argument. At best, they're an idiot. At worst, they are like a monster. So be able to understand that it's still logos, even if it's a fallacy, because they're presenting it as though it is logic, even if it is illogical. And then finally, ethos. This one's the kind of the trickiest one for me. Ethos is authority, and it can show up in a lot of different ways. And it's not always the speaker saying, hey, I'm an authority. Often the best example of this is an advertisement where a company will bring on a celebrity to sell a good, right? So you have someone, a hip hop artist comes on to try to sell you a shoe, right? Well, like what does Easy know about shoes? So false celebrity, or not false celebrity, false authority is a big one, right? In the same way that logical fallacies are still logos, false authority is still authority. And so we get this a lot, like it's an advertisement in particular. But when people are not an expert, but they are being presented as though they are an expert. Um, and yeah, and there's a strange line there. Right. There's a famous commercial of Michael Jordan and Larry Bird in a McDonald's commercial, and they're like playing basically horse for a Big Mac. And it's like, are they authorities on what I should get for lunch? Well, I mean, all humans, I guess, could be an authority on we all eat lunch, right? And so bringing on these basketball superstars to sell a hamburger, right? It kind of blurs the line of like what would be an actual authority in this position. I'm not sure there is an authority on what to have for lunch. Um, Other times though, you have like um important tools like a shoe, right? Shoes are something that are really important. I'm a lot more likely if a company comes on and shows like a nurse and they're like, this is the shoe I use every day. And then there's actual footage of them in their daily life using a shoe. The one that gets me is when they bring on NBA players to sell a shoe, but then it's not the shoe that they wear in games. Because if it's like you're selling the shoe you wear in game, awesome. And in fact, that's a much more effective advertisement. If I'm looking to buy a basketball shoe, I'm going to look at like what players are wearing in game, not what they're selling to me on the TV. Um, and so being able to recognize that, when is this a person of actual authority? When are they actually an expert? And when are they not? When is their celebrity being used? But again, in the same way that logical fallacies are dangerous and can be used effectively if not caught and like critically examined, and judged, right? Because that's kind of our job for doing analysis, is to make judgments, to say, is this text good? Is this text bad? Meaning, is it persuasive? Is it not persuasive? And being able to judge ethos, being able to judge, is this person actually an expert or not? If they are, I kind of put my shields down and I'm going to listen to them, right? I'm going to say like, okay, what they're saying is coming from some position of authority. I can agree or disagree, but I'm a lot more likely to at least be open to what an expert says than I am to someone who I judge as not being an expert. Right. So hopefully that helps a bit with ethos, pathos, and logos. Again, I'm going to send out a YouTube video, very short, sub 4 minutes, um, with a much simpler explanation of these things. The big thing to remember is kind of two major things I really want you to keep in mind as you're when we get to writing the essay, which we're still a week or so away from that. But one, don't overthink it. I know the way I wrote the assignment sheet, it's really easy to get lost in all of those options. I'm throwing a lot at you. Hopefully you don't get analysis paralysis of looking through. What that is meant to do is kind of help you organize your thoughts if you're, or to give you ideas for what to write about if you're not having ideas yourself. Ultimately, you can write about anything you want. What I want to see is that you paint a complex picture of the text through connection making, right? Are you seeing different things in the text and you're saying like, oh, I see the speaker is really revealing their agenda here, or oh, I see where they're using logic here, or oh, I see where they're really working against the audience's resistance here. And then being able to connect that and say like, okay, well, because I know the audience, because I've looked at the context, I know the audience is going to be resistant to this idea. It makes sense that the speaker would use this type of message. And therefore, in my judgment, this is a persuasive text because of the way these elements are working together, because of the way this text is kind of operating. As I'm looking at all these pieces, all these moves that this writer is making, to me, that means it's persuasive. Or to me, all of these moves they're making are ineffective. All these moves, they didn't take into consideration this and this. And so this text is not persuasive. It's bad. That's all I'm looking for. I'm just looking for, are you seeing a couple things? Can you connect them to build a complex picture of the text? And that brings me to the next point. So the first point, like, don't overthink it. And I think that's deeply tied to go with what you're seeing, use your intuition, right? Really sharpen that intuition, sharpen your instinct for what am I seeing, and just go with what you're seeing, right? There is no, is my idea good enough or is it not, right? Every idea you have is good. Everything you're seeing is solid. The question is, can you clearly describe it, right? If you see, oh, I think that the writer's done something interesting here, even if it's just a phrase, it doesn't have to be these really big, like, I see what's going on that at the level of this paragraph. Point to sentences, point to something where you're like, I think there's something there. I think it's interesting. It's not the biggest thing, but I think it's very revealing of what's going on here. Go with that, right? Don't overthink it. Don't put too much pressure on yourself. The things you're seeing are solid. The question is, can you clearly describe what you're seeing? And then can you connect what you're seeing to other things that you're seeing? Really wanting you to focus on making connections, because that's where you get the interesting ideas. I see this interesting sentence, and then another paragraph, I see this interesting sentence. Now, what happens when I put those two sentences in conversation together? You know, in this sentence, I really see where they're being effectively using logos. Here, I see where they are addressing an an audience's potential counter argument. This makes for great persuasion because they presented a strong argument and they've also dealt with any arguments against that argument. That makes for a great paper. Boom, that's all you got to do. So understand that assignment sheet, it's just options. It's just things you can do, especially that first list. There's kind of 3 bullet points. Those are just general things you can do, general things you could focus on, and types of connections you can make. If that's confusing, just put that first list aside and just focus on that second list of core tasks. Those core tasks of I need to identify some kind of context. I need to identify the audience. I need to identify some rhetorical appeals. Focus on that second list. And if at any point you just don't know what to write about for any given moment in that second list, go up to that first list, and that will give you options for things you can look at, types of connections you can make, and stuff like that. I can imagine that you barely give a glance at the assignment sheet and just write a crackerjack paper, making interesting connections. I'm a lot more interested in again, sharpening those instincts. Show me what you're seeing, be able to connect the different things you're seeing together. I'll be super happy, and you'll have an A on this paper. So again, that assignment sheet, it's just meant to give you ideas. Definitely don't follow it to the T. And I know that might be frustrating for some, especially, I know that for a lot of you guys, you're used to having assignment sheets and you have to follow them to a T. But getting into college, it's a lot more about critical thinking. It's a lot more about being self-directed, and it's a lot more about kind of finding your own way and doing something interesting more than it is like following the assignment sheet to a T and getting all of those little points. So I'm pretty lax. I'm not here to fail anybody, especially some high school students who are trying to get ahead. So show me what you got. I mean, I'm more interested in what you're interested in than in you following my directions rotely. So hopefully that helps. That whole monologue was meant to kind of take some pressure off. Do your thing. Remember, we're going to draft this. So next week we're going to start outlining the essay. And yeah, so that'll be your first draft. Your second draft, you'll take that outline and you'll translate it into an essay. I'll comment on that, and then you'll have a third draft to improve. So if there's anything that's deeply not working about your essay the first time around, you will have time to fix it. So no rush. Sharpen those instincts. If you think it's an interesting thing, your reader will probably think it's an interesting thing. I'll probably think it's an interesting thing. And yeah, do your thing. So hopefully that helps. Again, I'll be sending out a YouTube video with the rhetorical appeals. You don't have to watch it if you know everything about ethos, pathos, and logos. Awesome. But if not, definitely watch it, and it should get you up to snuff with what the rhetorical appeals are. If you haven't already, be sure and go and watch the assignment sheet breakdown, and then look over that assignment sheet. And again, we're not starting writing yet. I just want to give that to you as early as possible so you can kind of go over and internalize kind of the things you need to be looking for. Yeah. And by the way, one thing we haven't talked about yet is exigence. There will be a reading from the textbook. If you don't have pack prints yet, you need to get pack prints. We'll be doing a reading. In fact, I'll go ahead and assign that here. I'll do an announcement with the assignment as well. But the reading begins on page 68, and it is all analysis begins with exigence. I wrote it for the textbook. And exigence means purpose. So this thing here in the middle, we didn't talk about purpose. What is the aim or goal for creating the message? That is exigence. Exigence just means purpose, but the text will walk you through that, exactly what exigence is and how to kind of figure it out. And ultimately, the exigence of the text is your thesis, where you say, for this text, remember you're analyzing two. For this first text, the exigence is to persuade people that AI art is bad, because AI art is going to put artists out of the job, right? So it's sort of like exigence is ultimately identifying the thesis of a text. Because most texts aren't going to be like essays you write where the thesis is in the first paragraph. Sometimes you have to dig to find that exigence, to find that thesis statement. Some of you may find text where it's right there in front of you, right in the first paragraph or two, they state exactly what they're trying to achieve. The question is that actually what they're trying to achieve, or are they saying that that's kind of the surface purpose of the essay, but actually they're pushing something a little bit deeper than that? That's what makes for great analysis. So when you're looking at that assignment sheet, there is exigence there. That's, I think, the only element we haven't discussed in this video is exigence, but we'll have a reading for that, and that will walk you through it. So be sure and look at that, listen to the breakdown or watch the breakdown. Yeah. So